Welcome everybody to the August Soils Network of Knowledge webinar brought to you by the New South Wales DPI Soils Unit. So now I'd really like to introduce Janelle Jenkins, who's presenting today's webinar, Soil Testing Results for the Riverina High Rainfall Zone. A bit about Janelle. Janelle's a Senior Land Services Officer, Mixed Farming Systems with the Riverina LLS, or Local Land Services, based at Tumut. Janelle has more than 20 years experience in agronomy and natural resource management in the medium and high rainfall zones. In previous life, she's been an extension agronomist with New South Wales DPI located at Albury and also at Taree. Janelle has extensive experience in pastures and has facilitated cooperative research and development between DPI and LLS. Janelle also worked for DPI and Salinity with me, and I can attest to her hard work ethic in the field. She's passionate about doing work that's useful for landholders. She's also a semi-professional cyclist, aren't you, Janelle?
Not anymore.
So, no.
All right, let's get started. So I want to talk about a project we've been running in the Riverina. So the project is a collaborative project between Riverina LLS and New South Wales stud merino breeders, and it was undertaken with funding from the Australian government through the National Landcare Program. So the results I'm going to present today are basically results from soil testing that we've been taking. Soil tests that we've been taking from the mid and upper regions of the Riverina area, and it's basically a practitioner's view of what's going on in this area, and it would be similar to other areas in these southern zones. It's the program we've been undertaking is a bit similar to some of the projects that have happened in the past. So Holbrook Landcare have been taking soil tests for a long time, and previous to that, there was a project called Healthy Soils, Healthy Landscapes that did similar sorts of work. So the way this project's working is that there's two workshops. First one, we go through landholders with the fundamentals of taking soil samples. They then go off and take their samples. And then when all the results are back, we have a second workshop where we look at what the numbers mean, do some fertiliser budgeting, predominantly for phosphorus and sulphur, and then we look at lime application and do some liming rate calculations. Okay, so I'm going to give you the take-home messages to start with, and then I'll show you some of the data that we've collected. So graziers, particularly graziers, don't appear to be soil testing regularly. A lot of comments from the people that were undertaking the soil testing workshops were that they hadn't soil tested since Healthy Soils, Healthy Landscape, and that would be a program that was around 10 years ago. And the results we can see in the soil tests, the results that have come back is that fertilisers and particularly phosphorus and other ameliorants are either being over or under the targets for those particular soils. Another take-home message from this is that subsoil acidity is alive and well, and there seems to be a lot more traction about that at the moment, with DPI doing some work along these lines as well. Another take-home message is that farmers have generally forgotten about using molybdenum, and I'll talk you through that a little bit more as we go. Okay, so a background to why this came about. In 2015, I undertook a project in the Riverina called the Trouble with Sub project, which was doing a survey looking at subclover nodulation and trying to work out what was going on. Anecdotally, farmers had said subs weren't growing as well as they had been in the past, so this survey was actually trying to quantify that. So in the Riverina, I surveyed 81 paddocks, and that project has also been replicated in other areas. So Central West was done in 2015. Southeast, Central Tablelands were done in 2016, and Murray are doing 2017. So as part of that project, we took soil samples and also landholder histories, and it became pretty obvious that that graziers particularly weren't soil testing regularly, like I said before, and that soil chemistry was having an impact upon legume growth, and we found correlations with phosphorus levels, aluminium and pH. sulphur and EC. And we were seeing, and I was seeing, particularly in the Riverina, large variability in phosphorus levels, well over or well under target levels. So what did we do? What soil tests have we been taking? And this project is actually continuing on this year as well. So we've been taking mostly micronutrients. So it's essentially a good pasture test that we've been taking. So organic carbon, potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium, major cations, sulphur, phosphorus, and then we're collecting some other chemistry. We've been taking pH and calcium chloride, phosphorus buffering index, EC, ESP, and CEC. So when I've looked at the data for this presentation, I've actually split it into two types of areas. So I've got a mixed farming area and then grazing areas, because it's obviously a little bit different. So mixed farming areas encompasses places like Illabo, Millvale, Maringo, Young, Cootamundra, Harden, Temora, Gundagai, Wanabadgery, Huron Creek are some of the places that I've run this workshop. And grazing areas, predominantly grazing areas, have been Bynalong, Bookham, Tumbalong, Adelong, Tarcata, Rosewood, Harden, Kiamba, and some parts of Gundagai. So the soil tests I'm going to present the results from come from about 750 soil tests that have been taken, and of those soil tests, almost 90 of them were a subsoil test. The grazing areas are predominantly permanent pasture, sometimes native, sometimes introduced pasture. Mixed farming areas were pasture they may or may not be in rotation with crops. So some of the paddocks that we look at from the mixed farming area will be pasture as well as permanent pasture, but it was just easy to break them up on area. Okay, so the first results we're going to look at are phosphorus Coldwell. So based upon the PVIs of the samples we've taken, the target Coldwell level for the majority of these samples are going to be somewhere between 29 and 34. So what you can see from this, that 40% of the grazing area samples are below target, but also 30% of those samples are actually above target. So there's a big variation in phosphorus levels across the graze areas. So if you look at the little table beside, I don't know, can you see hopefully you can see my mouse. This table is actually the raw numbers of where the samples fit into which Coldwell level, and then the maximum and the minimums are the biggest numbers that we got on soil tests and the lowest numbers, and the sample number is the actual number of soil tests. On this axis, this is just showing the percentage that fall into these categories, and that's pretty much how all the graphs will work from here on in. So what that's saying basically is that the fact that a lot of the soil tests are outside, either under or over the target level, that there's an opportunity for redistribution of resources. So maybe some of that fertiliser should be going into paddocks that are under target, or possibly where there's excessive amounts of phosphorus, being Coldwell levels, then perhaps farmers in that instance should be looking at other things like maybe liming, depending upon what the paddock's like. So that one's the Coldwell one. So next one we're looking at is potassium. So a general rule of thumb target for potassium is that you want at least 140 milligrams per kilogram of available potassium. Potassium is generally fine. Most samples that we took of the 700 are above the 140 mark, but there was a percentage, particularly in the grazing area, that were below that. And actually 10% of this 30% were below 100. So generally, if your potassium levels are a bit below 140, that can be okay because potassium can actually accumulate a little bit lower in the soil profile, and if you've got root systems down to that, they can rectify themselves. But if your potassium levels are below 100, it may not be the case that there's enough potassium. So there are questions about whether applying potassium is economic and whether you get the growth responses from that, but it's valuable information to know, and it might be worthy of a test strip to see if you can get growth responses. The next one I want to talk about is sulphur, and this was a really interesting one. And this was one that was highlighted from the subclover project, where we actually had a pretty strong correlation between poor nodulation and low sulphur levels in soils. And what you can see is that nearly 50% of the paddocks that we tested were below the target. So the general target for sulphur is about 8 milligrams per kilogram. They say 5 to 10, but below 8 you're getting on the lowish side, and above 8 you're usually okay. But 50% of both the grazing and the mixed farming area paddocks were below that 8 threshold. So from the subclover project, we know that if you want good subgrowth and you're on low pHs that would be hard to rectify, you need good sulphur levels to actually help with that interaction. It will help sort of give you compensatory growth. So based upon this information, 700 samples from the Riverina, they're on the lowish end of sulphur, as well as when we look at pH, you'll see that the majority of them are also acid. Next one we looked at was soil carbon. And basically in grazing situations, 50% were below benchmark. So if you say that soil carbon benchmark of about 2% organic carbon. Now, there's no real benchmark for grazing, so I'm actually using the cropping benchmark. And we know that once you get below 2% soil carbon in crops, you're actually then having an impact upon growth due to water holding capacity. So I've just used that as a surrogate for grazing as well. So that's not unexpected in a grazing situation, because some of these paddocks are actually very light, skeletal soils, sandy, and they're not going to actually be able to hold very much organic matter. But the big surprise for me when I looked at this data was that in the mixed farming area, that they had such low levels of organic matter. So 82%, so the blue in this, were actually had a organic matter status less than 2, which is a bit surprising, because generally in these mixed farming zones, the soils are better. They usually have a bit more input in them, both from a nitrogen point of view and fertilizer point of view. But and they also usually have some sort of a crop pasture lay system. So what this is telling me is that perhaps our pasture phases aren't long enough to actually counteract the loss of carbon during the cropping part of the rotation. The other issue may be, and I'm not exactly sure, is that whether there's enough nutrient going on to actually help sequester carbon. So we know from the Clive Kirkby work that you need enough nitrogen, sulphur, potassium, etc., to actually sequester carbon. So I'm wondering if that's not happening in the mixed farming, those mixed farming areas. Okay. There's, some interesting work there. Next, I'm going to talk about soil acidity. So I've got some quite interesting data from that. We know that soil acidity is caused by product removal, nitrogen leaching, some fertilizers, and a little bit by organic matter build-up. And we know that it has an impact upon nutrient availability. And for those of you who hooked into Sue Ogle's and Belinda's webinar, that plants have a reasonable tolerance even legumes, particularly subclove, have a reasonable tolerance to lower pH and aluminium, and in the case of legumes, that tolerance is more than the actual rhizobium. So with that in mind, let's have a look at some of this acidity data that I've collected. So this is showing the percentage of paddocks that fall within these pH ranges. And this is for all the paddocks that we tested, so the 700 odd that we tested. And what you can see there is that the majority of the paddocks have a pH below 4.9. And we know that in these soils, and I can see it when I plot the pH data against the aluminium data, once these soils drop below about 4.9, aluminium starts to become in solution, and the further you drop below, the more rapidly and more aluminium actually comes into the soil solution. And that's very evident from the data. So in grazing areas, we've got 76% of the paddocks, so the blue graphs here, are actually less than 4.9, and in the mixed farming areas, 46% below 4.9. And that's just for the topsoil. So I had a selection of paddocks, and this is those there, where the farmers actually took a topsoil and a subsoil from the same paddock. So in this graph, what you're looking at is the pH on this axis. The first blue line is the topsoil, and all of these pH results are in calcium chloride, I should have said that. And the red bar beside it is the same paddock, and that's the subsoil, so the 10 to 20 for the blue line, which is the 0 to 10. And what you can see here is when you get up into these areas where you can see quite strong subsoil acidity developing in some of these paddocks. So the topsoil, the blue line, is a lot higher in pH than the subsoil. So this is all the 80 paddocks that I had data for, so I'll go to the next one. So in this instance, what I've done is I've pulled out anything that wasn't showing subsoil acidity, and I've just left in the ones where it's definitely showing subsoil acidity. And I've got 47 paddocks where the pH of the topsoil is greater than the subsoil. The average difference between the subsoil and the topsoil for those 47 paddocks is about 0.8 of a pH unit, so it's fairly substantial. And when you look at the end of this graph here in these areas, you can see quite strong subsoil acidity developing, where you've got obviously paddocks that have been limed at some stage, this group here, and then you've got pHs down to 4.5-ish in the subsoil and occasionally less. So why we're interested in that? Because we know that once you develop subsoil acidity, it is really hard to rectify that, even if you're in a cropping zone where you actually can incorporate lime. If it gets too low, it's still quite hard to increase the pH. And once that happens, then there are limitations on what you can do with those soils. I know that DPI are doing some pH stratification work. So what I'm showing you here is the gross amounts for the topsoil. It might be actually even worse than the topsoil. You know, the pH being at 6 might be only in the first couple of centimetres, and the rest of that 0 to 10, or maybe the 2 to 10 could be a lot lower than that. We didn't actually take those sorts of tests because we just bulked it over the top 10 centimetres, but it could be very interesting if we were able to look at that data in a bit more detail. I'm just going to show you the grazing. I only had 7 paddocks from the grazing areas where they've took the 2 depths for pH. There's a much less difference in that, and it's probably not a good enough data set to say too much about. I'm actually starting to encourage graziers to strongly encourage them to take subsoil samples particularly if they're doing any sort of pasture renovation. I'm really sort of pushing them to do that. Okay, so if you develop subsoil acidity, and it does appear that it is quite alive and well, then your options are limited to really growing tolerant varieties. This is particularly in grazing areas. To use molybdenum, and we know from the subclover project where we got landholder histories that only 4% of landholders from the 81 paddocks that we sampled in that subclover project had put molybdenum on in the last 10 years, which is a pretty low number. We know that molybdenum helps clovers fix nitrogen. So there's a whole a lot of production missing from those systems because potentially from the lack of molybdenum. Your other options is to add fertiliser, particularly phosphorus and sulphur, to help those pastures grow in acid soils. And finally, maybe you will add lime, and that's in pasture situations not always the go-to option. If you're going to add lime, you need soil depth, you need to be able to incorporate it, and that means that you're in a pasture renovation phase, and you need to be able to grow lime responsive species that you're going to get extra benefit from to actually cover off on the economics of lime. And that's not always the case in some of these paddocks where they are very light soils. And in some instances, they're growing native pastures, and it's hard to justify the cost of renovating a pasture when you're getting as much production as you would from the natives as you might from an introduced. So when we talk about this stuff with the landholders, we actually ask them to think about it by putting a common sense approach over what their decision making is. Okay, so basically in summary, subsoil acidity is very evident in mixed farming zones, I don't really have enough data from the grazing zones to say much about those. Molybdenum isn't really being used regularly. Both I know that from the subclover project, which I've talked about before, but also from the landholders that are involved in this project. Very few landholders have, and I asked them at every workshop if they've been applying molybdenum, and very few have been. Hopefully a few more will after this, attending the workshops. Many paddocks are exceeding phosphorus target levels, so that has issues where it grossly exceeds the target levels. When you've got cold water levels at 220, as in one case, you don't really need to put any more on for growth. And if you lose topsoil, then you end up with a whole heap of eutrophication of waterways. And also it's a lost opportunity. That dollar that's going into phosphorus in those particular paddocks could be put elsewhere and raise the general farm productivity, not that particular paddock productivity. Soil organic carbon levels are generally low, particularly in mixed farming areas. And I'm wondering if this has got something to do with pasture length and interactions with other nutrients. And sulphur levels are quite variable, with 50% generally being below target. And sulphur is something that we need to think about, again, from a legume point of view, because we've shown that there is a definite correlation between low soil sulphur levels and low legume nodulation, and then hence low potential ability to fix nitrogen. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Australian Government for the funding, New South Wales stud merino breeders for being involved in the project with us, Riverina LLS, and also Holbrook Landcare, because I use one of their phosphorus budgeting tools in the workshops that I run. So, any questions about any of that?
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. Abby Jenkins may have had a question here. Just unmute you, Abby.
Yes, I had a question, and I assume that lots of people listening would be interested in this, given that we've sort of talked about it in past webinars around soil testing, if people were here for Lisa Lobry-de-Bruin's webinar. But how do you think we can encourage graziers to test their soil more regularly, Janelle, and indeed is it needed?
Well, I think the results show that it's needed. If you know that you've got subsoil acidity, then you can make some informed decisions, particularly when you're going to, choose species to grow in those soils. So, and the phosphorus story itself. I mean, there's missed opportunities there as well with over applying it on some paddocks and under applying on others. The other question about how do we get them to undertake more soil testing? These sort of subsidised programs like the one I'm running, Holbrook runs, and Healthy Soils, like they've got their place to a degree, but I don't know that we've been very successful in getting people into the mentality of taking soil tests and then monitoring them over time, monitoring paddocks. So I'm really not sure. I actually think it's more a sort of a social science thing where you need to think about what you need to do to actually motivate them to test more regularly. So I'm open to suggestions from people on that one. I think
do you think
that's a whole discussion. Sorry?
I just was asking, do you think there's a perception amongst that industry, particularly that soil testing is not needed?
Well, in grazing industries, it's definitely less common. People do test, but it's definitely less common. But in even in mixed farming areas, they're testing, but they're only testing the topsoil, and we need them to actually start really testing the subsoil, because those guys do have options when it comes to subsoil acidity. Is that an education thing? I'm not sure. I would have said, we've had acid soil action, we've had various programs, and they're still not really testing the subsoil. So I'm not sure. I really think that's something that needs discussing at a bigger, like an industry level.
Yeah, I wonder if as there's a push towards more, I don't know, precision farming and that sort of stuff, and using information in decision support systems, whether that might help drive that. I don't know.
It'll help drive it in farming zones, but in grazing zones, I don't know. There are areas, like we have people around here in grazing systems that will do grid sampling, but they are definitely the exception and not the rule. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's okay. It's like a more than educational. It's something else.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I think it's like you say, there's part of social science in it, and finding out what the barriers are. Yeah. And what the incentives are as well, yeah.
And the incentives aren't always financial. It's not always a subsidised soil testing program. It's something else, but I'm not sure how you get around that. But yeah, there's definite benefits.
They're not always. It can be different things. I'd say there's lots of more questions now, Luke. So I'll be quiet now.
You're right. No, thanks very much, Abby. I'll let you mute yourself. We've also got Darren Cribbs has made a comment here.
I was just, I do soil sampling for a living, but I think it's very difficult, and there has been some research done, certainly in California, in some of the tree crops, about the value that growers perceive from their analysis. And the precision agriculture is linking soil attributes directly to yield. And I think that's one aspect of what we miss in terms of what the presentation was today about the monitoring of soils. People are still interested in getting yield and how it correlates to what their soil looks like.
Yep. So, actually, good point. I'm actually thinking about a new project where I'm going to try and do some of that. So, if we can get some funding, as you know how the funding thing goes, and actually look at growth rates under different regimes, under a few treatments. But yeah, we couldn't answer it in this particular exercise because it was just what you're saying is sort of bulk results from soil testing, essentially.
Could I have another question if the time's there?
Yeah, go for it, Darren.
In the main pH slide, there was on the right of the screen, where the difference is. What are those paddocks? Are they particularly cropping paddocks that have had different treatments? Is there a generalisation you can make there?
No, these paddocks here, and because I know what the codes are, you're looking at things like Gundagai, Kiamba. These are very much definitely grazing paddocks. And on the left of the screen, you're looking at Wanabadgery, Huron Creek, those sorts of areas. They are definitely mixed farming paddocks, so they go into crop pasture lays.
Yeah, well, that was my point. Is that specifically different? So there is a mixed system in this right-hand side of the screen in general.
Yeah, so when you look at the codes, which I can tell, so from Young through Wanabadgery, Huron Creek, Illabo, those paddocks have been limed for cropping, and that says the red are the corresponding subsoils. And as you can see, there is some pretty low pHs over lime topsoils in the subsoil.
So incorporation to depth is still an issue with stratification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. And this group of results here are showing that. I mean, obviously this guy's got it right. I don't know what he did to actually get his lime down into his subsoil, but the rest of them are actually showing impacts of subsoil acidity.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. No worries.
Thanks, Darren. We've got a question from Lisa Lobbery de Bruin, so we'll go to Lisa.
Yeah, I suppose I sort of my question changed as I was listening, but I was just interested to know, in your soil health workshops, were your participants, were they involved in the soil testing in any way? And also you did mention that talking about, I think you were questioning how do we motivate people to soil test. So I was just wondering, how much do you think soil health improvement versus, production would motivate people to soil test more? So yeah, this is a discussion I just had with my students actually, is the difference between short-term goals and longer-term goals, and the fact that soil health seems to be seen as a long-term goal rather than a part of the short-term production goal. So I'm just wondering how we can change the narrative a little bit and emphasise that soil health improvement, for instance, can actually benefit their short-term goals as well as their longer-term goals, because I think people are forgetting that a healthy soil is a better functioning soil. So I don't see why they have to be a choice between production and soil health. Like, I think if a farmer's focused on improving his soil health, he's going to get production benefits as well. Not that you separated them, but I think the narrative is often this separation between soil health's a long-term aim or goal, whereas production is what they're focused on. But why should they be separate? I don't understand that.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first question, the farmers actually took all the samples. We talked about sampling. I gave them all the gear, sent them on their way, and then when the samples came back, they went off to the labs, and then we got back together and we talked about the numbers and presented similar graphs to this for the groups. So they were involved in that side of it, and they also were involved in actually looking at their own test results and then looking at fertiliser requirements and calculating what your target is and for lime and phosphorus, etc. Now, the bigger question that you're asking me, it's a hard one. I know that when Healthy Soils, Healthy Landscapes went through the Harden district, because I was sort of around at that time, and they had realised that they had a massive subsoil acidity issue. And, you know, as the soil action sort of came out of that, you know, was part of that. But then, you know, moving on 15 years or whatever it was since then, things haven't really changed. I think people sort of put it in the too hard basket a little bit because it's so hard to rectify that issue. Yeah, like they know that they need to be doing something about it, but because at the moment it's very hard practically to have an impact, they just sort of continue on, and things are actually getting worse. So no, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you sort of. Yeah, there is no separation between production and a healthy soil in the longer term.
It's just interesting how this is sort of like, I just read a paper recently, but yeah, it was just interesting how they were separating the two. Like it's a binary choice, and I just don't think it's necessarily. I don't think they're in competition with each other, but it seems to me that that's the way the dynamic's been set up that way, like that. You know, soil health is something you aim for in the long term, whereas actually in the short term it should have benefits as well.
Yeah, and
yeah.
And
anyway,
the organic carbon is actually an interesting figure when you look at it. You know, I mean, if you
Yeah, well, I suppose I've come from Western Australia, and I found that, you know, because we have very low carbon levels as well, and we're farming a lot of sandy soils, that, you know, there's very few opportunities to build that carbon. And is that the same in the Riverina? Like, it's very difficult to build carbon up?
Our CECs are nowhere near like you guys. We actually do have clay in the soil.
Okay.
And we grow some clover, we grow clovers. So no. And, you know, the fact that, I don't know, where is it? The grazing systems that really are a lot lower CEC across the board and you know, have correspondingly less organic matter. You'd expect that. But then mixed farming soils, these soils here are actually generally high CEC, generally, not always, and you know, more fertile soils, and they've got substantially lower carbon in them. And they should, you know, most of those soils, there's no continuous croppers in that sample group. They all will have a pasture phase at some stage, but I'm wondering if that pasture phase has been long enough, and if they're aware of the implications of that going back into the crop. You know, once your organic carbon levels get below 2, and the impact upon production. Maybe we're not selling that message well enough.
Yeah, I know. Well, I suppose the crop rotations have increased, haven't they? So they'll be cropping a lot more than they used to. Yeah, longer.
It's longer. Yeah.
Yeah.
But at a cost, and I think we're seeing that cost now.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks, Liz. Jim has put his question in there. I'm going to read out Jim's question, Janelle. So Jim's asked, are you happy that everybody sampled to a consistent depth and also obtained a representative sample, and were all samples sent to one NATA accredited lab?
Okay, the lab was Nutrient Advantage, so they're NATA accredited, and they all went to Werribee. So that answers that question. Depth, I supplied the chorus, so I'm hoping they used them as I instructed them. Now, representative, I can't really answer that one. When I gave them the cores, I actually talked them through the process of taking a representative sample. So hopefully they listened to me, but, you know, there could be a variation in there, I'm sure, on how different people have undertaken, you know, their sampling. You know, I asked them to I asked them to sort of zone up their paddocks and not put whole paddocks in where there were obvious differences. But I can't promise you that they didn't mix up, you know, zones, etc. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yep. So Jim has replied in. He's typed in, say, thanks, Janelle.
No worries.
You've answered his question. And I can't see any other hands up or any questions we haven't dealt with at this stage. So then we might call it a day. And thank you very much, Janelle, for your webinar. And you could see from all the interest there, really interesting stuff there to look at, and some long-term issues, obviously, that are not resolved, and we'll have to look. Darren Krebs has said thanks, Janelle. I'll just take the opportunity to say that next month's webinar is from Mark Peoples from CSIRO, titled "Are There Useful Rules of Thumb to Assist Farmers' Nitrogen Decision Making When Wheat is Grown After a Legume?"
And Luke, it's Abby here. I'd just like to also take the opportunity to reinforce what you said before, in that there's 20 odd SNOC webinars up on the New South Wales DPI Agriculture YouTube channel, so you can reach them through that way, or you can look at the soils pages on the DPI Agriculture webpage, and they're linked in there as well. So if you missed one or you want to see one again, that's where to go and have a look.
Thanks very much, Abby. We've actually got another. Lisa Lobry de Bruin has asked Janelle, where is Janelle Jenkins, and can we get in contact with her?
Yeah, I work for Riverina LLS up at Tumut in New South Wales, and yeah, you're more than welcome to contact me. My mobile's 0427 63 9947 if you want to give me a ring.
And I imagine, Janelle, if Lisa was to go to the Riverina Local Land Services website, there'd be a phone number there if she's...
There'll be a phone number that you'll be able to track me down. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everybody,
Cheers.
and look forward to seeing you next month.